Where do you get your inspiration?
I do a lot of research based on ideas that I find in newspapers and magazines. So I'll be reading just the daily newspaper, something online. New York Times, I get a lot of ideas from the New York Times. And I see stories about people, and then those inspire the characters in my books, the conflicts that people are going through in real life.
Okay.
There we go.
How do you decide what to write?
Do you mean how did I decide to write novels and short stories? Is that what you mean, like the genre?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to write for a long time. When I was a kid, I loved reading, and so I read everything that I could get my hands on. But I decided to write novels and short stories because I wanted to be able to make things up about real life. So I didn't want to write like fantasy, like Game of Thrones or Twilight. I'm not really into things like that. I wanted them to be really based in reality. So usually, whichever characters are most interesting to me at the moment are the ones that I'll write the story about. So I kind of go where I'm inspired and then go from there.
Okay. How many books have you written?
Your mom has asked me that question before, and I can never actually remember. Full-length novels, I think, is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, and then short stories is about the same number.
What kind of books do you write, and how do you choose that type?
I write romance novels, and I write them because they were the stories that I wanted to tell. So I wasn't a writer for a long time. I had office jobs. I worked for an insurance company. I worked for a pharmaceutical company. I was a consultant. And all the time when I was doing those jobs, I kept saying, I wish I could be a writer. I wish I could just write the stories that I see in my head every day. And the stories that I saw in my head fit into the romance novel category. And so that's how I started writing romance novels. And then when I was in graduate school, I did research on romance novels and women in romance novels and how they get written. And that really spurred my interest. And I decided that I wanted to try and write one. And so I did.
Have you ever had writer's block, and if so, how did you get past it?
I have. And the way to get past it, well, there's two ways that I found that work. One is that you need a break, and so you should just take a break. But the other is to just keep writing. And so if I don't know what to do in a particular story, if that's why I'm blocked, then I write something else in that story. So if I'm at a particular point where, I don't know what happens next in this scene, but I can see something else, a later scene or the ending or revisions to earlier scenes, then I go ahead and do those. And I'm more likely to do that than I am to take a break. I think you should just keep working in some capacity. Otherwise, the breaks can kind of start to build, and then you don't write anything for a while, and it's hard to get started again.
What's your biggest weakness as a writer?
Oh, boy. No one has literally ever asked me that question before. I think I am probably too wordy. So when brevity is really called for in a scene, when it's important to be short and snappy, either a short scene or short sentences, short dialogue, action tends to be written in very short sentences. That's hard for me, and so I have to go back and revise that a lot to really make the scene or the chapter work the way that it's supposed to.
Have your other activities ever stopped you from writing for a long period of time?
You mean like being a mom or having a full-time job?
Yeah.
Yes. It's hard. It can be hard if you're not really disciplined and dedicated to make time for writing. So when my son was really small, I had to choose to send him to daycare or get somebody in to babysit him so I could get a couple of hours of writing time. But I also have friends who've had full-time jobs, and then instead of getting up at 5:30 to go to work, they would get up at 4:30 to write for an hour and then go to work. And they would write on the bus, they would write on the train, they would write wherever they could, basically. I mean, a lot of people that I know in my genre work full-time, and they would write in their cars on lunch hour. So I think that there is truth. I mean, people's lives get very overwhelming, and I'm not downplaying that at all. But if you can carve out even half an hour a day, you will make significant progress towards your goals if you just put a little bit of time into it. Even a little bit makes a difference.
When did you first start writing?
2008.
When did you publish your first book?
2009. That's pretty quick.
How did you feel when you published your first book?
Really, really excited. I was very, very happy that day. There's no doubt about it. So, but I have a funny story about that. So the day that my first book came out, my husband was out of town, and I took myself out for lunch to celebrate my first book being published. This was the day after it came out. Okay, so it came out on a Wednesday, and then on a Thursday I went out to lunch to celebrate. And while I was at lunch, I got a phone call from another editor who had a different book of mine. And I thought, oh my gosh, my life can't be this amazing. It would be just like out of a story if the editor calls the next day and I sell another book the day after my first book came out. But she wasn't calling to tell me that she wanted to buy it. She was calling to tell me everything that was wrong with it. And she didn't buy it. I went home not very happy. But I kept on writing, and I revised that book, and I sold it to a different editor.
What steps do you have to take to publish a book?
Well, the first thing you have to do, if you're just talking about publication and not the writing process, is you have to finish the whole book, and then you have to go through the revision process. You need people to read it who will tell you where they think that you could make changes to make the book better. And sometimes you take those changes and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you want to invest in it and sometimes you don't. And then for most people, what you do is you go through a submission process to get an agent. And then that agent will represent your work to New York publishers. You can also self-publish, which you can do on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And you can sell those, you can upload the files and sell the books there without needing an agent or a New York publisher. But then you have to do all of the advertising about your book yourself. Whereas with New York, then the book goes out to reviewers and it can get some momentum from that kind of backing for your book. But the first thing you have to do and the most important step is to write it and make it the best book that it can be.
Do you have any certain habits when you're writing?
Yes, I have a very structured process that I go through, and so every day when I sit down to write, I go through a process I call pre-writing. So before I get to my computer and actually start typing up that day's word count, I sit down and I handwrite out just little descriptions of what I'm going to write that day so that I have some idea of what I'm going to do when I'm at the computer. And then when I sit down, I set word count goals. And so I'll write for an hour straight using the outline that I've prepared for the day. And then usually each day I would try to hit my word count. Like I wouldn't stop writing until I had hit that word count. So it's a process called fast drafting, where you don't go back and revise as you write. So that's my daily process. I would pre-write and then I would write to my word count goal for that day, and then I would stop because if you do too much work, you can burn yourself out and have a hard time getting ready to do it the next day. So you have to pace yourself. You have to be dedicated, but you have to pace yourself too.
Are any of your books connected in the plot line, or are they all separate?
Some of them share characters. And one series that I'm just finishing has shared an overarching plot line, so something that's carried through all three books in the trilogy. But for the most part, I write standalone books. So there may be characters that are mentioned from book to book, but the plots are all separate.
Are you unhappy with any of your books?
No, I don't think anybody's ever asked me that either. Let me think about that for a second. I don't know that there are any that I would say, gosh, I really wish I could have that one back. I'd like to do it over. There are characters that I wrote in shorter novellas that I wish that I could write a longer book about. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with them. And then I try not to dwell on what's done. So the book is done and it's out, it's been published. You can't get it back. The only thing you can do is go forward and write the next book and try and learn from your mistakes. They don't all have to be perfect, and they won't be. So you just keep moving.
Which is your favorite book?
Which is my favorite book?
That you've written.
That I've written? I wrote a book about a woman who was in very restrictive circumstances, and the book is about how she had a family that wanted her to be a certain way and to be a certain kind of person, and she wanted to be her own woman. And so I wrote the story of how she went through that process, and I really like that book. I mean, that one is the one that I'm most proud of.
Where do you see your career going in the future?
Oh, I don't know. I'm kind of on a hiatus right now. So I haven't really written anything new since June of last year. I don't think I'm going to keep writing romance novels. But what I'm going to do in the future, as far as a writer, I'm working on a memoir right now. And after that, I don't know. We'll see.
All right. That's all the questions I have for you.
They were great questions.
Thanks for taking the time to answer them.
You're welcome. Do you have any others you want to ask off the record?
No, I think that'll be it.
Okay. Good. I'm glad I could help.
Don't hang up. Awesome. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Let's keep talking while I have you here.
Okay. I'm going to take you to my studio and show you what I'm working on.
Oh, perfect. That sounds good.
Can you stop the video first?
Oh, right. Yeah, let's stop recording.